So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at growth and that idea of economic growth, which is going to appear on the AP macro exam. There are two modules to be aware of here, kind of module 37 and module 40. Both of those do a nice job of kind of summarizing economic growth. Now, the basics of what you need to know is that growth is about productive capacity. So one way to think about this is to say growth is equal to a change in full employment, and that growth is not equal to a change in output. And so if we had, for example, a change in aggregate demand, that's not going to produce economic growth. That's just going to change the amount of output. So growth is not the same as the amount of output. It's actually the amount of productive capacity. And that's a really, really important phrase to be able to master. So let's kind of put a star next to that one, productive capacity. Now, there are three sources of economic growth. Those are resource availability, actions that affect producers, and productivity. And these are the aggregate supply shifters. So if you remember, we had IRAP, inflationary expectations was also part of that. We wouldn't necessarily say expectations about inflation are a source of economic growth, but the other three things, are. So here we're talking about oil, or we're talking about immigration, right? We're talking about things that affect how many resources you have. Here we're talking about, I'm putting these in parentheses, regulations. And productivity is really the big kahuna, right? This is the one that we really, really care about in terms of society, because this one is actually how we really get a lot of economic growth in most developed countries. And in that, we talk about physical capital, and we can get that through more investment spending. And we get more human capital, and we get that through training and educating your workforce, right? Having a very productive workforce. And then technology, which we get through, I'm going to put another arrow over here, research and development, or R&D. Now, the most common question that you're going to get asked is going to say, what's the impact of the real interest rate on economic growth? And what we would say, a typical answer kind of works like this. It goes, if the interest rate real goes down, we would say, therefore, investment spending will rise. Therefore, there's an increase in productive capacity. And if we have more productive capacity, that's literally saying we have more economic growth. Now, in political circles, sometimes we actually call all of these policies, right, these policies in particular, aggregate supply policies, supply side economics. And the idea being that if you, and this could be kind of controversial for some folks, but if you have more business spending, right, businesses spending money, and you deregulate, if you deregulate, that's kind of the A in RAP, and you have more resources available, more research and development, and that kind of thing, that will create growth. And that can be kind of a very politically hot button issue, but in economics world, these aren't necessarily as controversial. This story that we kind of tell over here is a little bit controversial because there's some questions about how true it ends up being, but in general, it ends up being pretty well accepted. So at this point, that's kind of the basics of growth. And again, we've learned a lot of that material already. The next part is something we've also learned, and that's the idea of showing growth in the PPC. So we'd have a capital goods on one axis and consumer goods on another. And we would usually draw a little PPC like that, and we would say, we'll show a point of full employment. And we'll say that's point A. And show growth. Well, growth would be a new PPC that shifts out on all of the different points. And so we'd say, well, you're now out here at point beta, and that point has more capital and consumer than you used to be able to produce. So the growth is not just the fact that we went from A to B, right? This is not growth. not growth. The growth is the showing of the shifting of the curve. That's the growth part, right? So that's an important observation. Now let's take a look at what growth looks like in kind of the long run a little bit here. And so in the ADAS, excuse me. So do a little graph here, and we'd have output and we'd have price levels. And we would say that growth is actually a shifting of the LRAS. So it would shift to the right if there's more full employment level of output possible. And so that's growth. What we would say is not growth, and this is kind of the distinguishing factor here, is if we had an aggregate supply and an aggregate demand, and if aggregate demand just shifted outward, right? Yeah, I get it. We are producing more than we used to. We have more produced there. But at the same time, this does not necessarily represent, sorry, we'll kind of move the page down just a little bit. I'm struggling here with my new technology. But this part that's not growth. So we're going to annotate and say, not growth. The growth is when, again, we have change in YF. That's the important part. So hopefully this video has helped you understand kind of some of the distinctions between growth and not growth and what are some of the ideas behind it. I'll see you next time.